From CBS News headquarters in New York, this is the CBS Evening News, with Dan Rather substituting for Walter Cronkite, and Peter Collins aboard the USS Blue Ridge, Ed Bradley in Manila, John Lawrence in Paris, Peter Kalischer in Da Nang, in Washington, Phil Jones, Bob Schieffer, and Hal Walker.
Good evening. South Vietnam now is under communist control. Early today, beginning with a jeep load of rather ragtag Viet Cong soldiers, then truck after truck of heavily armed North Vietnamese regular troops, the communists entered Saigon in force. South Vietnamese President Duong Van, so-called Big Men, just 2 days in office, surrendered his government unconditionally. Communist tanks smashed through the heavy gates of the presidential palace, flew the Viet Cong flag overhead, and took men away in a jeep. His whereabouts are not known. The surrender came just 4 hours after the last Americans were pulled out of Saigon, now renamed by the Viet Cong Ho Chi Minh City. Here is the first film of that historic evacuation. Peter Collins reports.
The sky over Saigon was filled with dozens of assorted aircraft, helicopters, transports, even fighter bombers in a nameless whirling merry-go-round over the city. The U.S. Embassy helicopters flew from roof to roof, plucking up stranded Americans and occasionally depositing them on the landing pad atop the embassy. But from the roof of the Caravel Hotel in downtown Saigon, it looked as though every pilot in the South Vietnamese Air Force who could get his hands on an aircraft had decided that now was the time to get away. It was mid-morning when the word came. A full-scale emergency evacuation had been ordered. All Americans were to report immediately to assembly points designated weeks in advance. When buses arrived at the assembly points, they were soon jammed with anxious Americans and some Vietnamese who slipped aboard. Then came a hair-raising ride to the airport. American Marines brought in to guard the helicopter landing zone stayed close to bunkers, as the steady thump of rockets and the clatter of small arms kept up throughout the day. The landing zone was the parking lot of what used to be the American military headquarters in Vietnam, once known as Pentagon East. But now the huge building was a last-ditch holding area, while overhead big Air Force and Marine helicopters arrived to land at intervals of about 5 minutes. Inside the building, the evacuees were broken into groups of 50, and then it was a mad dash out the door into the parking lot for the waiting helicopter. Although it seemed much longer, it took only 2 or 3 minutes to load the helicopters, and then it was farewell to Vietnam. To avoid the threat of surface-to-air missiles, the big chopper skimmed low over Saigon, with the door gunner at the ready and the engines deliberately set to produce a stream of white smoke so that any aircraft crews would have a hard time spotting it. It was a 45-minute ride from the encircled and threatened city of Saigon to the safety of American aircraft carriers waiting offshore. Below, on the South China Sea, thousands of other Vietnamese were fleeing in an armada of boats. Hundreds of vessels of all size, ranging from patrol boats to Vietnamese Navy warships, all making their way out to the American 7th Fleet and presumably hoping for an eventual voyage to the United States. On the midway, the refugees are led quickly away from the howling blast of the helicopters by Navy crewmen. For them, it is only the first leg in a journey away from Vietnam and the war, but perhaps an uncertain future in America. Peter Collins, CBS News, with the final American withdrawal from Vietnam.
South Vietnamese military servicemen and their wives today continued to arrive in Thailand, apparently the last of an estimated 70,000 Vietnamese who fled their country just before the communist takeover. More on the flight from Saigon from Ed Bradley.
The crowds of Americans and other foreigners lined up at installations around Saigon waiting for buses was the cue. It told the Vietnamese that this was the end of the line. For most of those who wanted to leave their country, this would be their last chance. Some Americans who pushed towards the bus tried to pull their Vietnamese wives and children along with them. There were desperate scenes with families separated and crying out for help, pleading not to be left behind, clutching at the last straw of hope. We rode through the streets of Saigon for more than 4 hours, unable to find a way out or anyone who could tell us where to go. At Tan Son Nhut Airport, armed paratroopers turned our buses back. At one point, we were unloaded on the Saigon waterfront, where we could see American helicopters circling the city, and Vietnamese trying to escape on boats heading to the sea. No one wanted to be left in this crowd that at times was strangely quiet, but that always was on the verge of panic. We all decided to try and reach the United States Embassy, and once there, we found it surrounded by Vietnamese looking for a way in and a way out. Helicopters were landing on the roof and inside the compound as we walked to the back of the embassy. We had to push and shove our way through a crowd of several hundred Vietnamese trying to scale the walls, only to be knocked back by U.S. Marines. Once inside the compound, for the Americans and those Vietnamese who managed to get in with legal documents, and the many who managed entrance without, the rest was easy. It was just a matter of waiting your turn for a helicopter to take you to one of the ships on station off the Vietnamese coast. The American fleet had been having problems since the start of the evacuation, not with the arrival of South Vietnamese pilots and their helicopters loaded with family and friends. Hovering above the decks to unload their passengers, the pilots were unfamiliar with landing their craft on a moving ship. One crashed into the side of the USS Blue Ridge. Others managed to crash land on the deck of the ship. For those that did manage to put down, they were simply pushed over the side and into the sea by U.S. sailors and Marines to make room for the returning American craft based on that ship, filled with evacuees from Saigon. Other South Vietnamese pilots just hovered long enough to unload their passengers and then headed to the side of the ships and just jumped out with their life vests to be picked up by U.S. sailors, their helicopters crashing into the sea. Still other pilots headed out to the side of the ships after unloading their passengers and settled the craft into the water and then jumped out, again waiting to be picked up by U.S. sailors. Many hours later, as one of the last evacuees arrived, U.S. Ambassador Graham Martin, the final American ambassador stationed in South Vietnam. After so many long and bitter years, the American involvement in Vietnam was over. Ed Bradley, CBS News, Manila.
Last Friday, former South Vietnamese Premier Nguyen Cao Ky exhorted his countrymen to remain in Vietnam even if the communists took over, saying those who flee are cowards. Today, Ky was reported on an American evacuation ship in the South China Sea after being taken from Saigon on an American helicopter. In the early hours today, between the American evacuation and the communist arrival, almost every building in Saigon that was abandoned by the Americans was looted. Chief among them was the U.S. Embassy, where everything was stolen from a paper shredding machine to, literally, the kitchen sink. Just before the communists entered Saigon, one government police colonel walked to an Army Memorial statue at the National Assembly, saluted it, then fatally shot himself. Elsewhere in the city, government soldiers threw away their guns, discarded their uniforms, and tried to melt back into the crowds. There were sporadic outbursts of gunfire as the communists marched into Saigon, some of it from die-hard government troops at the Presidential Palace and at the Saigon Zoo, some of it from celebrating Viet Cong soldiers. But overall, it was a well-disciplined, peaceful takeover. To the south and west of Saigon, however, the Viet Cong says that there still are 8 provinces, quote, not yet liberated. We'll have a direct conversation with correspondent Ed Bradley via satellite from Manila in a moment.